Good morning. My name is Matthew Johnson, and welcome back to another morning devotional here at Glencoe United Methodist Church. I am the pastor here, and I am thankful that you are joining us for our new theme, which started Monday, but I didn't go into details yet, really, because I wanted us to get into the nitty-gritty after explaining what this theme is. The theme that we're going to be talking about is disciples, the disciples who followed Jesus, or as I am referring to them, the faithful few. Now, we'll get into the details of the disciples each day that we have our morning devotional, but it's going to be an exciting experience for us to go into Scripture and talk about these different individuals, and I think that you're going to enjoy the immersiveness that you're going to get from this. Now, note, we could spend a lot of time on all of these individuals, but we are going to be doing snippets to the end of making things shorter. I don't want to keep you here for 40 minutes or an hour or anything like that, because let's face it, they teach classes on books of the Bible, and they teach entire lectures, and some people even write books about people in Scripture. So the fact of the matter is we don't have time to go into everything, but guess what? You have a Bible, and you have the opportunity to jump into that Bible and learn more about these individuals. And if you ever have questions, come to me. I'm always here to help you out and explain what I can. But before we get started, let's talk about the disciples. According to the scriptures of the synoptic gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you have these 12 disciples, which are Simon, or otherwise known as Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew, James, Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanian, and Judas Iscariot. When you go over to Luke's, there's another Judas in there who was the son of James rather than just having Judas Iscariot. And that removes Thaddeus altogether. So we need to think about it this way. You have these different disciples, right? And they're all following Jesus. These are the 12 that are referred to. But these are not the only followers of Jesus. There are also more people who are following Jesus from town to town to town. But these are the 12 that were instructed specifically to go out and do healing and tell the good news that is Jesus. So we want to talk about these individuals as the faithful few, so to speak, because they're specifically pointed out in Scripture. Now, we're not talking about the women such as Mary, Martha, and all of them, but they are also important. So we will get to them eventually, just maybe not in this particular set of morning devotionals. But I promise we will get to them eventually. Even if it's not on here, we will somewhere. Because they too deserve the attention that these disciples are getting. Now, what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about Judas Iscariot. Judas Iscariot is always viewed as a terrible person. And the fact of the matter is Judas is not this horrible person. Judas is a flawed individual, like all of the disciples, who did end up betraying Jesus, but was also remorseful about betraying Jesus. He made mistakes, and he really did feel guilty for making those mistakes, and it cost him his life. So let's think about who Judas was. Judas Iscariot was one of the 12. He was called to follow Jesus, and he followed them in all these journeys. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke talk about it, and John as well talks about Judas Iscariot. But then in Acts, he's no longer there. So first off, we need to think about, okay, where did he go? Well, if you've read Scripture, you will know that Judas killed himself out of the remorse that he had. Now, Judas was oftentimes the treasurer, or the one who held the piggy bank, so to speak. He kept up with the money. And according to John 12, Judas was also a thief. He was stealing from the money. And I think that what's interesting is that there's no clear explanation as to why Jesus was betrayed by Judas. Now, we do make two assumptions. One is it was for the 30 pieces of silver, and two, that Satan corrupted his heart and caused him to do that. Both are valid reasons based on Scripture. But I also think that we can think about it in the sense of there may be more going on there than meets the eye. Because you got to remember, when Jesus called these disciples to go with him, he called them to leave their old lives behind and follow. Basically, leave everything you have and go. I can imagine that life is hard and has a lot of stress and puts a lot of extra pressure on someone who is not used to that kind of stress and pressure or lifestyle. And I can imagine that it was difficult trying to follow all of these other disciples who were also flawed. And you got to remember, the disciples argued about who was greatest in the crowd, who was most favored. I mean, think about it. If they're arguing with each other, there's that added tension. That alone gives you this extra part of the picture that you don't always get. If they're arguing about who's the greatest, you can tell that there are egos that are spilling out. So I can imagine that Judas Iscariot, dealing with the pressure of leaving, the pressure of living a new lifestyle, the pressure of trying to be a good person, trying to do these things such as healing and keeping up with money to make sure that they have the money for what they need, whether it's giving to the temple or what have you. All of this and the egos as well, the dynamics between the disciples themselves, which we don't get a lot of in Scripture. There are only pieces of it, and those are very enlightening, like about the ego stuff in Luke 22, I believe. You have all of this going on. And now you have Judas, who was a sinful human being, just like we all are. A man who was following Jesus and still believed and loved Jesus to the end. Who followed Jesus but was flawed. One that followed Jesus but yet made mistakes and failed Jesus. But Jesus still loved him. When Judas Iscariot goes to Jesus in the Garden at Gethsemane and he kisses him on the cheek, Jesus tells him, "Do what you have to do, brother." And then the guards came and they arrested him. That was the sign. That was the indication of who Jesus was. That was the identifier. It is interesting. Whenever we talk about Judas, we are so set on condemning him instead of trying to understand him altogether. We need to understand who he was. We need to understand that he was not just part of the disciples, but he was a human being. He was one that made mistakes. He was not perfect. The only perfect one that ever lived was Jesus, and he died. Out of remorse, he returned the 30 pieces of silver after realizing what he had done, the gravity of the issue of his betrayal. And he gave it back. And they didn't even want it. Instead, they took that money and said, "We can't take it. It's blood money." So they divvied it somewhere else. And he was so heartbroken by what he had done, he killed himself. He committed suicide. He hung himself. And if you read Acts chapter 1, it gives you a more gruesome picture of what actually happened. He not only hung himself, but when he did, it split him open and his insides fell out. Can you paint that picture? It's horrible. If you want to talk about a human being who was flawed, who made mistakes, who followed Jesus, but still loved Jesus in the end, even after all that he had done, Judas would be a perfect example. We oftentimes like to lift up different people. Peter, Moses, David, all of these different individuals in Scripture We lift them up as these mightier than thou, these holier than thou individuals. But yet we don't take the time to consider the flaws in their character, the flaws that they exhibited each and every day of their lives, the flaws that made them so relatable to us today. How many times can you say that you failed God? How many times can you say you've betrayed God? Through your actions, through your words, through your treatment of others? How many times can you say that you strayed to the point that you were remorseful? How many times can you say that you gave up on God, even if it was for a moment? It's interesting that we all have this opportunity to go and follow God. We get this gung-ho feeling, and we go and we have this power, this fire, and we just go for it. But yet, what ends up happening is that we get so burnt out real quick. The world hits us hard. The world hits us with the sinfulness that exists, and then we struggle with the world that we're living in. Maybe it is the temptations by Satan that he gives us every day. Maybe it's our own selfishness. Maybe it's our own pride. Maybe it's our own greed. Maybe it's our own inclination to violence. Maybe it's our own inability to empathize with others. Maybe it's our own inability to understand who God is, what God has done, and how God is trying to fix the world that we live in. Maybe it is those things. Maybe it is something else. Maybe it is the fact that we are all flawed in general, and that we have to understand that, and that we have to try to reflect and find ways of doing better. Maybe it means that we should be remorseful. There's a wonderful individual who writes books and does research on empathy and shame and stuff like that. Her name is Brene Brown. She's written many good books, and I would recommend any of them to you. Any of them. One thing that she says in one of her lectures that I've heard was she's comparing shame to guilt. Can you guess which one is bad? It's shame. Guilt is healthy. Guilt helps us grow, but shame, that is a negative influence. That is something that's problematic. For all of you parents out there, have you ever shamed your children, or have you only guilted them? And be real. Did you guilt them, or did you shame them? Shaming them puts all the blame on them. It makes them to be the bad person. Guilt, it gets them to think about what they've done. I think, to be honest, Judas was shamed. He was guilted. And the shame and the guilt weighed on him. And because of that shame, it led to his demise. Likewise, today, when we shame others for making mistakes in life, then we too are not being fruitful. We are not showing the gospel, because that creates negativity. It creates chaos. It does not bring out love. It does not bring people back into the fold. Jesus says to his disciples that if someone messes up, talk to them. And after different tries, they do not get the point or do not change, then you kick them out of the community for the betterment of the community. But if they're willing to change their ways and do better and be ready to grow themselves, then they should be welcomed back with open arms. Friends, when we live each and every day, how are we being like Judas Iscariot? How are we failing God? How are we betraying Jesus? And are we remorseful in our betrayals, in our failures? Is that remorse making you feel guilty? Are you growing from those mistakes and becoming a better follower of Christ? Or are you staying where you are or regressing? Because here's the thing, friends. We all have so much potential to offer up to God. There's so many different ways that we can express God's love in this world that for me to prescribe one or two things to you would do a disservice to God, because God uses our talents and our gifts and our opportunities to serve and to live and to be fruitful and multiply. If you think about it, multiplication in this instance is not just about procreation like it is in Genesis, but instead it can also be about spreading the gospel. Because as we make disciples of Jesus Christ in the world, we are multiplying. This does not mean forcing others to become Christian. It does not mean creating fear in order to become Christian. You're going to hell because you're not a Christian. That is not the way we should do it. I've seen it done that way. And I've seen the hurt and the lives of those affected by that. They were so fearful of eternal damnation that they did not see who Jesus really was. It is my hope and prayer this day and every day, for that matter, that you go in peace, that you reflect on your life, that you see your errors, and then try to grow from it. And remember that Jesus will always love you, and that Jesus is always with you, even when you feel alone. Do not let Satan tell you otherwise. Do not let people tell you otherwise. Do not let your own mind deceive you. Friends, we are all Judases. We all fail and betray Jesus. The question is, what are you going to do about it?